Chapter 4. A gentle alarm pinged in Daniel Flynn's ear, providing a momentary respite from yet another paper on the evolution of MMDs and their various impacts on society. Not that this particular example was as tedious as some of the others. At least this student had explored the effects, both positive and negative, of MMDs on crime and labor practices. Too many of his pupils couldn't see beyond the daily necessities of matter manipulation technology to understand any negatives at all. Of course, these were middle schoolers, but Daniel thought most adults weren't substantially different. Carson, where's Jason? The domestic AI, a model far less sophisticated than Anna's Simon at work, provided a blunt answer. In his bedroom. Anna sometimes complained about Simon's personality, but Daniel thought it might be nice for Carson to do more than provide simple answers sometimes. Good evening, Mr. Flynn, for example. The grass is always greener. Standing up from the kitchen table, he closed out the essay to focus on more parental responsibilities, one of which his timer had ensured he wouldn't forget. He stepped over to the kitchen MMD, selected what he wanted, then picked up the bottle of water it assembled. As he made his way back toward his preteen son's bedroom, he thought about Anna. He'd received a message from Simon informing him that she would be out late working on a case, but that had been several hours ago with no communication since. This wasn't atypical. Her job with the MMD agency often put her in situations where she couldn't contact him, but he would always worry about her. Yet, whenever he thought about the constant danger of her job, he also considered what the world would be like if people like her weren't there to do it. MMDs were an intrinsic part of his daily life, of everyone's daily lives. No previous time in history had experienced a leap forward in the average standard of living like the past few decades. People were no longer trapped in an endless cycle of acquiring possessions that fell apart and had to be replaced. With code and raw materials, anything that could be coded could be assembled. Anything that wore out could be refreshed or repurposed. But some people coded dangerous things, and that's why his wife had to put her life on the line. New drugs, new deceptions, even new forms of torture and murder existed because of MMDs, and Anna spent every day fighting criminals so that people like him, and kids like their son, could enjoy the benefits of this tech without being subjected to its dark side. Daniel pushed these thoughts aside as he entered Jason's room and smiled affectionately at his son. "I've got water here for you." Jason was sitting up in his bed reading a comic book, the colorful page lit only by the lamp on his bedside table. The 12-year-old had inherited his dark hair from Anna rather than the tangle of red that adorned Daniel's head, but his green eyes came from his father. In the last year or so, Jason had started to sprout, and his height now exceeded that of most of the other kids in his grade level. He did well enough in school, though Daniel thought there were times he fell short of his potential. More important than that, however, was his kindness. Anna always remarked on this aspect of their son's personality. "If we get one thing right, I want him to be good to others." Daniel couldn't agree more. The teenage years would soon be upon them, bringing many changes. Jason's innocence wouldn't last forever, but Daniel and Anna both hoped they'd laid a solid foundation for whatever came next. "Thanks." Jason received the water from his father, took a sip, then set it down next to the lamp. "Where's Mom?" "Still at work, I assume." Daniel tried to keep his tone positive. He wasn't the only one to live with the persistent fear of the day that Anna wouldn't come home. Taking off his data lens, he folded back the earpieces and slipped it into his pocket. Using the bracelet on his wrist, he gestured to the wooden chair across the room and pulled it up next to the bed. As he sat down, he glanced at the comic book in Jason's lap. "What are you reading?" Jason looked down and shrugged. "Something about a warrior in space. Not what I'm usually into, but Nevaeh gave it to me, so I said I'd give it a look." "I'm sure you will." Daniel approved. In contrast to the many forms of creativity now digitized, comic books were still mostly a physical medium. Readers appreciated holding the art in their hands and turning the physical pages. At one point in his life, Daniel had collected comics. A few boxes in his tinker room testified to this. But after Jason's birth, he hadn't had the time or energy. He appreciated his son following in his footsteps. "Nevaeh is your friend who wants to be a government agent like Mom?" "That's her. She dreams of fighting bad guys with a combat staff, flying through the air, and using MMDs programmed to do crazy stuff. Says hunting down illegal mods is way more exciting than the old vids of detectives with guns shooting at each other. I'm not sure she gets what it's really like, though. Oh, how so? Well, it's only that Mom talks about writing reports, interviewing people, and doing research. It's not all the action Nevaeh thinks it is. Daniel chuckled. I'm glad for that. I don't think I could handle anything more intense. Teaching is more your speed. Jason paused. Mine too, I think. Oh? This was the first time Daniel recalled Jason talking about teaching. He'd always been his mother's son, active in sports, spontaneous, and full of energy. Not that Daniel thought he'd follow her into law enforcement, but at least something that would keep him on his toes, perhaps like a lawyer or a doctor. Yeah, Dad. I've been thinking about it the past few weeks. I realize I'm not the best student, but that makes me appreciate what you do more. All the time you put into kids like me. Daniel laughed again. If only my students thought like you. I think most of them believe it's my job in life to make their lives more difficult. You don't know, though. I mean, we're supposed to hate school, but more of us like it than you think. Daniel marveled at his son, 12 years old and so innocent. Those teenage years were looming. Jason, you aren't thinking of this way because you doubt your ability to do other things, are you? Jason shifted in his bed. I don't know. It seems easier, more reasonable. I don't understand. Even as he said it, Daniel admitted to himself that he did understand. He just didn't want to. You're smart. You're athletic. There are 100 different jobs you could do other than being a teacher. I love it, but not because it's reasonable, because it's a good fit for me. Jason crossed his arms. Is it, Dad? You went to college for programming and spend so much time in your tinker room. Is teaching really what you wanted? Daniel studied his son, suddenly uncomfortable. He tried to make his voice sound earnest. I had other options, but this is what I chose. When your mother and I got together, being a teacher is what made sense for us. So why wouldn't it make sense for me, too? It might. He paused. It might not. Just please understand that Mom would have supported me doing whatever I wanted, and we'll support you too. Whatever you think is right, we'll make it happen, including being a teacher. You need to be who you are, not what everyone else expects from you, not even your mother or me. Jason heaved a heavy sigh. I will. Sometimes it's hard to know what that is. Daniel reached over and grabbed his son's hand. You're 12. You've got a long time to figure it out. Please believe that Mom and I will always be behind you. I know, Dad. He stared into his father's eyes. If I don't know anything else, I know that. Daniel squeezed and let go. Never stop believing that, Jason. We should do your prayer. Jason nodded and then dropped his head. Dear God, thank you for this day, for my mom and my dad, and watch over Mom, wherever she is. And Jason is thankful for my family. Amen. Daniel started to say good night, but a chime in his pocket diverted his attention. He pulled his data lens out and saw on his name. Well, those prayers were answered fast, kiddo. He indicated that Jason should put on his own data lens, and when they were both ready, he clicked to answer, unable to mask his relief. Hey, honey. Hi, Mom. Hey, boys. Daniel's body tensed at the weakness and pain in her voice. What is it? Are you all right? Jason peered up at his father, the worry evident on his face. I will be. I'm sorry. She took a moment, then continued. I wish I could have called earlier, but there was an incident, and I was out for a bit. Daniel frowned. As in out of touch? No, unconscious, after an explosion. The lightness in her voice betrayed the significance of the words, and Daniel's sense of alarm prompted several rapid-fire questions. An explosion? Are you okay? How long were you out? This wasn't Anna's first brush with death at work, though explosion was a new addition to her growing list of dramatic encounters, and Daniel felt the same dread he always did when he learned his wife had been in harm's way. It awoke something primal in him, a need to protect her. The irony wasn't lost on him that this same instinct was what drove her to do the job that put her in these situations. Not too long. 20 minutes or so. The medical team has been looking me over, and I don't think anything is permanently damaged. What happened, Mom? I can't give you the details, but if you check the news, I imagine you'll find something. A lot of people were hurt. Daniel, I'll send you the address where I'm at. As the location popped up on Daniel's data lens, he noticed Jason searching the net for the story. I've got it. I'll come to you. Jason peered up at him, eyes eager and pleading. Me too. That would be wonderful. I want to see you, Daniel. Anna's tone shifted into something more parental. Jason, I need you to stay home. You have school in the morning, and this is a crime scene, not the place for a 12-year-old. Jason's face fell in disappointment, and Daniel suspected his son not only wanted to visit his mother, but to tell Nevaeh all about it the next day. I figured. After a momentary grumble, his enthusiasm rebounded, and he sent Daniel a link. I found this on the news. It looks like the explosion was big. Anna confirmed this much at least. It was. I managed to get pretty banged up, but my service weapon protected me. Daniel clicked through and watched the vid, which contained no images of the current scene. Instead, it focused on previously taken pictures of the home of Councilwoman Savitri Shah, which apparently was where the bomb had gone off. In some ways, seeing this was worse than seeing the actual destruction, because his mind conjured the worst-case scenario with windows blown out and floors collapsed. He closed the vid, wondering how close to the center Anna had been. I'm glad you weren't hurt too badly. Me too, Mom. Thank you, you two. Anna paused, and Daniel heard someone speaking to her in the background. Look, I have to go. There are people who want to talk to me. I'll see you soon, Daniel. I love you both so much. The call ended, and Daniel released a long sigh, relieved that Anna was safe. He held up a finger of warning toward Jason. Don't stay up too late with that thing. If you need anything, ask Carson, or you can call. I've got it, Dad. I won't stay up late, but no way am I sleeping without at least watching the story. Everyone's talking about this, and Mom's right in the middle of it. She is. Daniel didn't find the idea as exciting as his son did, though. Daniel caught up with the news feeds about the bombing as he rode to the crime scene in a bus. Owing to the national interest in Councilwoman Shah, every news source on the net carried the story, reporting that Shah and her husband had survived an attack from an unknown assailant. No details were given about the assailant's identity or fate, nor anyone else who had been in the apartment, certainly not Anna. Shah's importance could not be overstated, especially to the city of Houston, which owed its prominence in the global landscape to her. In days past, the city had been known for oil, but in the new solar and nuclear-driven economy, fossil fuels were worthless. Houston needed to reinvent itself, and Savitri Shah had orchestrated its reinvention, linking the city indefinitely to Future is Now Incorporated, for better or worse. Feeney hadn't invented matter manipulation devices, but they were the first to imagine and prototype MMD hardware small enough to be carried by individuals. As a fresh young councilwoman, Shah had identified the potential for growth and gambled big, brokering a deal to turn much of Houston's sprawling rural land over to Feeney for dedicated hardware assembly. In the following decade, MMDs emerged as a ubiquitous part of everyday lives, and while MMD programming took place all over the globe, Feeney assembled all hardware in their Houston area factories. 30 years later, both Houston and Shah were now central to the world's economy, and the sole reason Shah had never moved to Washington was her own insistence that her home city deserved her loyalty. Because political success brings risk, Shah had become a target for many dissident groups. While some were uncomfortable with MMDs in general, these numbers had shrunk in recent years. Many others took specific issue with Feeney as a corporation, and Shah's unapologetic support of pro-Feeney legislation rankled such sensibilities. The reporters covering the bombing were quick to point this out, fueling speculation as to who might have attacked Shah, tacitly pointing a finger at anyone who ever vocalized dissatisfaction with her or Feeney. As the bus neared Shah's neighborhood, a calm male voice addressed Daniel and the dozen or so riders around him. This vehicle is entering an emergency zone. Unless you have authorization, it will be routed to the closest dock in a neighboring zone. If you do not have immediate business in this area, please continue moving in order to keep it clear for emergency aid and law enforcement use. The others groaned, but Daniel wasn't surprised. The police weren't going to allow the general population to contaminate a crime scene. He used his data lens to open a connection to the bus and request access. Anna, or someone working for the MMD agency, would have provided his name so he could visit. He wouldn't be able to walk into the crime scene proper, but as the spouse of an injured agent, he'd be allowed to see her at least. The answer came via his data lens. Authorization accepted. This was followed by a broadcast message to everyone on the bus. Due to the prominence of an authorized rider, this vehicle will complete its route. Please note only authorized riders may disembark. As the others peered around, trying to discern who was receiving special treatment, Daniel feigned disinterest. He had no desire to explain his business in the zone. 45 seconds later, the bus docked on the 7th floor of an 18-story building, and Daniel stepped out onto the docking platform without ceremony. A few people tried to follow behind, but 2 officers in crisp blue uniforms intervened to let him pass while holding the rest back. He nodded and gave them a little wave of thanks, then entered the elevator that would take him down to the ground level. A minute or so later, Daniel emerged onto the lawn between buildings, presently abuzz with activity. Erected barriers kept onlookers away from the scene, but beyond them, plenty of city officials, medical personnel, reporters, and police officers milled about. Several people in suits were conversing with the mayor, including the chief of police, who had finished a press conference 30 minutes or so earlier. Daniel had seen a recap on the news feed during the ride over. The mayor, Catherine Dela Cruz, always commanded attention with her height, long blonde hair, and hard eyes. Daniel followed politics enough to be aware of her popularity, though he didn't have a strong opinion about her. He'd voted for her opponent, someone he believed to be a bit more capable of making real changes. Unfortunately, such a willingness was always a political liability, and Dela Cruz won her last election by a wide margin. Dela Cruz was one to focus on retaining her position, and since her office was elected, this made her somewhat beholden to voters, at least in any way visible to the public. Most people favored the status quo, while the few exceptions found their way into protest organizations which did little but meet up to air their grievances at one another. This meant Dela Cruz didn't have to do much other than not mess with anything people cared about, and she'd proven adept at this simple task. The real power in Houston's government, however, resided in Savitri Shaw. Mayors, police chiefs, and numerous other authorities in the city came and went, but Shaw would always be a staple, at least as long as she resisted moving to Washington. Given the decades she'd been resisting, Daniel didn't think that would ever happen. City council members weren't elected. They were appointed by other council members. She'd never not be reappointed, barring a serious scandal or death. The latter, at least, had been averted earlier this evening, which was a good thing. Daniel had his doubts about Shaw's politics, but no desire to see her murdered. He followed the lamplit path leading towards Shaw's apartment building, leaving the official types behind. The night chill pressed in on him, and he pulled his jacket close around his body as he walked. When he arrived at the crime scene, he encountered a taped-off area. His data lens also displayed a warning not to cross, so he approached the line and smiled at the burly police officer waiting there monitoring comings and goings. "Hey, I'm here to visit my wife, Anna Flynn. She's a special agent for the Matter Manipulation Device Agency." The officer nodded back at him without smiling. "Of course. I'll go let her know you're here." He turned and walked back around a makeshift tent, disappearing from sight. In the officer's wake, Daniel studied the scene before him. A few tents dotted the landscape, but beyond those he observed the apartment building itself, which wasn't as devastated as he'd expected based on the media hype. He'd thought a floor or two would be blown out, but the structure appeared mostly intact, a twisted metal entry gate notwithstanding. Of course, that made sense. If the explosion had been strong enough to destroy concrete walls, Anna wouldn't have survived. MMB-generated barriers were solid and reliable, but some forces couldn't be withstood. People flooded the lawn outside the building, not only police and medics, but also evacuated tenants. They stood in little clumps while police officers worked methodically through them, asking questions and escorting certain individuals away. Daniel thought it would be difficult to keep the crime scene clean with so many people trampling through. Expecting Anna to come meet him, he was surprised when a tall, dark-skinned woman in a well-tailored cream suit walked up to him instead. In her 50s and muscular, with hair pulled back into neat rows, Director Jada Davis projected authority. She was Anna's boss, but also her friend. Daniel knew they often worked out together at the gym in the mornings before work. He smiled warmly. "Director." "Daniel." She took his hand into a firm grasp and shook it. "Anna will be happy to see you. The nurses are still telling her to keep from moving too much, so I came to get you." This surprised him. "Get me?" She waved at the perimeter tape and a section disappeared, leaving the rest suspended in midair. "Of course, I don't intend to make her walk out here to see you, and it's not like we don't have hundreds of people already running around the place." He passed through the gap, grateful for the unexpected gesture. "Thank you." She reassembled the tape into a single strip, then turned and led him through the clumps of people and makeshift structures. "Your wife earned her paycheck today, and then some. You should be proud." "What did she do? I spoke to her earlier, but she didn't say much, only that she had been unconscious after an explosion. The news said there was an attack on Councilman Shaw." Davis slowed, and when she turned, he saw that a grim shadow had passed over her face. Yes, the councilwoman was attacked by a suicide bomber. He killed himself and 7 other people, though not Shaw or her husband, and not your wife. Daniel pulled up short, his mind reeling. People had died? He struggled to comprehend what she told him. Why hadn't the bomb been contained? Any MMD would be programmed with a trigger to assemble a protective field as soon as it detected an imminent explosion. He didn't doubt a wealthy individual like Shaw would own any number of MMDs coated with the most advanced safety tech that could be legally purchased. Perhaps tech that couldn't be legally purchased, given Shaw's relationship with Feeney. That people had died from the blast made no sense. But not Anna? Of course not Anna. He had spoken to her after all, but something in his brain needed to hear the reassurance. Jada gave a faint shake of her head and repeated herself. No, not Anna. Not her, nor the Shaws. A range of emotion washed over Daniel. Regret that he'd been sitting at home having dinner with his son while people's lives had ended. Relief that his wife had been spared. Confusion at what had happened. Empathy for the loved ones of those who died. He couldn't help but consider a different outcome, one where Anna had also been killed, and he stood here in this spot learning that the world he'd spent his life constructing was crumbling down around him. For others tonight, that was their reality. Maybe even the reality for another Daniel somewhere, if only in his imagination. He realized Davis was watching him process what she said and shook his head to clear his mind. I need to see her. She nodded, and they started moving again, this time at a faster pace. They entered a black-colored tent where Daniel found Anna lying down on a cot. Her face lit up as soon as she saw him, and he rushed over to her. Daniel, I'm so glad you're here. She sat up and embraced him, pressing her face into his chest. He held her close, pulling her head into his body. I am too. I'm so relieved you're okay. They didn't move for a few seconds, and Davis eventually broke the silence. I'll leave you two to talk. I still have a lot to do out there. Daniel let go of Anna and turned around. I appreciate it, Director. He watched her go, then returned his attention to his wife, anxiety washing over him again. How close were you? Her eyes watered, and she encircled his waist with her arms. Very close. He felt her tremble. I didn't think I'd make it. I thought it was over. Holding her tightly, his heart swelled as her body shook, but he was unsure what she meant. I don't understand. How did people die? From what I can tell, the blast was contained. She pulled back and wiped at the wetness below her eyes, then motioned for him to come close so she could whisper in his ear. I can't say much, but I can tell you the 3 who died in the explosion all had MMDs. This man... She paused, and Daniel waited, still holding his head next to hers. This man, he shot Lisa with a gun. Then he shot 4 security guards. Their MMDs should have stopped the bullets, but he had a mod that disabled them. And then he went after Shaw and blew up 3 people, including her head of security. His name was Klein. Seconds elapsed, as if the name meant something. To Daniel, it didn't, but Anna was clearly affected. I talked Klein through the whole thing, warned him about the attacker, that he was dangerous and could disable MMDs. Klein and his people waited for me to save them. I thought I had. But when the bomb went off, they died, and I didn't. My service weapon blocked the explosion. Her lips quivered. Why did my MMD work when everyone else's failed? Daniel studied her, the tears on her cheeks overflowing into his heart, and he understood. He saw the care lines creased across her face and tried to summon strength and deliberation into his voice. This wasn't your fault. You did what you were supposed to do. You saved the Shaws. No, I didn't do it. I don't understand what happened. I confronted him, and then he held out that bomb and... Her eyes unfocused as her words faltered. You stood in the gap, put yourself in danger. She nodded, but not at him, or even his words. At nothing. You couldn't save everyone. She didn't respond. He reached out and took her hand, sitting with her in the silence. After some time, she looked up and her eyes registered his presence again. Her tone was quiet and probing, vulnerable, but curious. Daniel, why did my service weapon work when the others didn't? He hesitated, then whispered, Your mods. You had something they didn't. She frowned, puzzled. How? I didn't have mods for this. I didn't know it was possible to remotely disable an MMD. They were interrupted again by a nurse entering the tent. Agent Flynn. He paused, looked at the pair with embarrassment, and then started again. Apologies, Agent Flynn. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I need to check out your vitals. How are you feeling? Daniel saw his wife gather her strength and rally a weak smile. Better. I'll be okay. I'm sure I can walk home with my husband. The nurse nodded. That's fine. Just let me check you out and give it a couple more minutes. She emitted a rueful laugh. Oh, it won't be that easy. I have a few dozen people who will want to talk to me before they go anywhere, but I'll get my walk at some point. Anna wasn't wrong. Agency business involving interviews and other official matters forced Daniel to leave her. As he stood outside the medical tent, the crowd began to thin out, and he felt the strain around it begin to ease. The sea of people had established a certain rhythm as people vacated the building and police conducted interviews before escorting them out toward the rest of the city. Many would be put up in local hotels, while others stayed with relatives. Director Davis's team and other agencies were buzzing about the scene, trying to make sense of what the bomb had left behind. Thoughts of the explosion and Anna kept running through Daniel's mind. Thank goodness for her mods. He had no doubt some would judge her a hypocrite if they knew about the programs installed in her service weapon, but hypocrisy was a simple sin, and his wife of 16 years was not a simple woman. Mods were tools, and tools possessed no inherent moral intent. But when it came to intent, he trusted Anna's without question, and tonight was all the evidence she'd ever need to prove her mods were necessary. She didn't have her service weapon in the tent, and he wondered where it was. He doubted she'd get it back anytime soon, as Davis and her team would want to dissect it to find out what had happened. Trying to be as casual as possible, he began to pick his way through the tents. Even though the director had let him in, he suspected that if anyone took note of his presence for more than a handful of seconds, he'd be waiting outside the perimeter for the next few hours. As he shuffled around the buildings, he encountered a table containing several objects he assumed had been recovered from the blast. A couple of broken tablets, some twisted data lenses, pieces from MMD weapons that he guessed belonged to the deceased guards, and his pulse quickened. Anna's own service weapon. It appeared intact. A man stood beside it, back turned, wearing a suit jacket and matching slacks. By his confident posture, Daniel took him for an agent. Inspecting the items on the table, Daniel noted Anna's personal data lens among them, smashed beyond repair. It had sustained a great deal of damage during the explosion, despite the MMD-generated barrier shielding most of the force. He glanced back at Anna's service weapon, her most prized possession, and a device he knew well, having seen it in their apartment many times throughout their marriage. Tonight, it had kept her alive. Not only her, but also one of the most important politicians in the country. He reached out to touch the weapon, knowing he was contaminating the crime scene, but compelled anyway. His fingers brushed softly up against it as he moved them down the length of the short piece of metal. Weak vibrations of energy flowed up into his hand, and the weapon emitted a soft chime. He pulled his hand back with the speed of a young boy caught raiding a cookie jar, and the agent next to the table whirled to face him, staff raised. Who are you? The man darted quickly around the evidence table, pressing Daniel back. Daniel faltered, holding his hands aloft with nervous energy. I'm Daniel Flynn, Anna Flynn's husband. Recognition registered in the agent's eyes, and he lowered his staff briefly before tensing and bringing it up again. His voice rose in anger, eyebrows furrowed over a stern glare. Mr. Flynn, what were you doing with your wife's service weapon? I don't know. Daniel hesitated, giving the agent an awkward tilt of his hands, trying to show submission. I almost lost her tonight, and if it weren't for... He motioned to the weapon, his expression miserable. She'd be gone. The agent considered him with narrowed eyes, and didn't back down. You're messing with evidence. That's a big deal. You can't be here. Director Davis let me in. She said I could see Anna. Agent Flynn isn't here. No, she isn't. She's giving a report, so I was forced to leave. After that, I wandered this way. The man studied him, eyes tracing the length of his body. Daniel tried to look sympathetic, to make visible all the pent-up stress he'd been collecting since receiving Anna's call earlier that night. You need to keep your hands to yourself. This isn't Agent Flynn's staff. It's the property of the agency. We're going to study it to understand what happened tonight. He repeated himself. You can't be here. Daniel nodded. I get it. I'm sorry. I was wrong. A few more tense seconds passed, then the agent lowered his staff. I'll let this go, but I'm going to have to report that you touched the evidence, and you should wait outside the perimeter. I don't think the director made the best decision allowing you back here. He tapped his data lens. I need an officer to the evidence table. Daniel exhaled with relief. Thank you, Agent Ward. I'm Agent Ward. He held out his hand, adopting a new, less aggressive posture. Your wife is a good agent. I'm thankful she was here tonight. I can't imagine what would have happened if the councilwoman died. Daniel took the offered hand. She is. I'm proud of her and beyond thankful she's all right. And that she saved Shaw and her husband. His tone grew somber. I wish so many others hadn't died. Ward shook his head. It's tragic. And senseless. A tall, dark-haired man in a blue police uniform walked up and addressed Ward with a deep voice. Is there a problem? Ward glanced at Daniel and hesitated for half a beat. No problem. But can you escort Mr. Flynn to the perimeter? He'll wait for his wife there. Of course. The officer motioned for Daniel to walk in front of him. Daniel took in a tired breath, aware of how lucky he'd been to get away with such a light consequence. He nodded at Ward. It was nice to meet you. I am sorry again about the evidence. Ward responded with a tired wave. It's been a hard night for everyone.
Exhaustion covered Anna's body like a blanket, and her mind existed in a perpetual fog. She'd relived the events of the evening 3 times since she'd woken up after the blast, providing every detail she remembered for the various interested parties. Under different circumstances, Simon's recording would have been available for scrutiny, but it had still been in local storage on her data lens when the bomb went off, so she was the sole source of information. Daniel had messaged to say he was waiting for her outside the perimeter. Someone had decided he shouldn't be here after all. The nurses had given her medicine, but the ache in her head continued to push through. The only thing she wanted was to be unconscious in her bed at home. Jada entered the tent, face set, and calm despite the madness of the past few hours. She shook her head, an emotion Anna would take for judgment if she hadn't known her boss better. Anna, you need to go home. She didn't object. I do. If it were up to me, I would have been gone a long time ago. The director nodded and allowed the hint of a smile. I don't doubt it. I'm sorry we had to keep you. An attempted assassination against a councilwoman, especially Shaw, demands a lot of scrutiny. It's been an extraordinary night. Believe me, I'm aware. Remember, I was there. Oh, I remember. Against my orders, if I recall. In spite of the stern face, Anna knew her boss well enough to see the humor in her eyes. Against my promise even, but you know I did the right thing. I do. A pause. I really do. If Shaw had been killed, it would have been that much more of a nightmare. Yes, and to that end, Washington is sending someone to our office, Director Elaine Guerrero. Anna shook her head. I've never heard of her. I'm acquainted. She works out of the main agency office, and we've met a few times over the years. Jada's tone gained an edge. I assume they want oversight with the visibility this has, but it's all nonsense. We know how to do our jobs, and they should be glad for it. If not on my account, at least on yours. Anyone else would have let Shaw die. Maybe, Anna shrugged. I'm not the only one on the team with a stubborn streak. Jada raised an eyebrow. Maybe the only one with both a stubborn streak and a touch of magic. Anna let this comment pass, unsure of the implication and possessing no desire to explore it. Well, this Washington director is free to do whatever she wants as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure there's a mountain of paperwork that needs to be filed and procedures which need to be drawn up. Try to keep her out of our way so Lisa and I can run this down. Naomi White is still out there, and there's no way more people weren't involved. That's what I do best, minimize the red tape. Anna grinned, and we love you for it. Her smile faded as the awareness of pain crept back into her consciousness. At any rate, I'm taking the day off tomorrow. I want to sleep all day and then sleep some more, and when I'm done, go visit Lisa in the hospital. She'd learned Lisa's wounds hadn't been critical, and she was recovering at Houston Central. Her partner had bled a lot, but the shot was clean and hadn't hit anything vital. Take as much time as you need. You have a good deal to process. We'll all be here when you're ready. Thanks, Jada. They both knew she wouldn't stay away long.
Daniel waited for Anna at the edge of the perimeter tape. When she arrived, he reached forward and lifted it up, unable to do Jada's trick of making a section disappear. As soon as Anna had ducked underneath, he pulled her close and wrapped his arms around her. She half whispered into his ear, "I'm so tired." "I know, honey. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry I got kicked out." She drew back a few inches and stared up into his eyes. "Daniel, it's fine. Right here and right now, this is where I need you to be. If not for you." She trailed off. He gently pressed her head into his shoulder. "Anna, I thought the same thing earlier. Even when I knew I hadn't lost you, I thought about what it would be like, and I don't even have the words to complete that sentence." They stood together for a long time, just outside the perimeter tape. He finally breathed in deep, let it go, and released her in the same motion. She moved away, grabbed his hand, and they started walking toward the closest building with a transport dock. Daniel noted the area was almost deserted now, a stark contrast from hours earlier when it had been a zoo of human bodies. The emptiness only increased his awareness of how cold the night had become. As they strolled, Anna began talking again, somber and reflective. "They say you see your life flash before your eyes, but what flashed before mine was all the years we wouldn't have as a family. You, me, Jason." He pulsed his hand in hers. "Honey, we have those years. We'll be together." She nodded. "I know. Believe me, I know. But there are 7 other people who won't have that. Klein seemed like a good man. I've been thinking about him all night, and I don't even know his first name. Whatever his life was meant to be is gone. All those lives are gone now. Ben's mods didn't come from nowhere, and whoever coded them brought guns back. These people are willing to commit murder, and I can't let them do it again." Her voice hardened, solidifying into determination. Daniel didn't miss the shift, and it worried him. He knew her driven nature, and also the weight she would try to carry on her shoulders. "Anna, that may be beyond your control." She shook her head. "It's my job to stop them. It's what I do." He sighed. "It is, but look at me." He pulled up short, and she stopped with him. They turned to face each other. "I love you. I spend so many nights at home while you're out doing what you do, wishing I could be a part of it. There was a time I thought that might happen, but instead my role is to support you, and I've accepted that." She put her palm up to his face. It felt hot against his skin. "Daniel, your support is everything to me. Don't doubt it for a second." "I don't, but I also understand what you feel. We all want to do more, find a way to right the wrongs. But sometimes we've done all we can do, and it isn't enough." He looked deep into her eyes. "Go after the criminals and figure this out. But just remember that you're human. It's not your fault that people died tonight." She closed her eyes, and as she did, some of the hardness left. Her head bobbed like a leaf on a gentle breeze. "Okay, you're right." She opened them again, and with this release, he saw her exhaustion return. "I'm so tired." "Let's get you home." They started moving again, this time in silence. Anna's hand felt warm in his, a contrast to the cold night around them. They reached the building and took the elevator up to the 7th floor. When they arrived, a young police officer stood next to the waiting bus. "The director has called ahead and said to hold a vehicle for you. You'll have it to yourselves. It's been programmed to take you to your residence without any stops." Anna nodded. "Thanks, it's great." And it was great. They sat on a bench in the center of the bus and rode to their apartment, holding hands and not speaking. Daniel sensed the exhaustion in her body and felt glad, at least, for the opportunity to be this for her, a comforting touch. Her burning need to do more and push against the suffering and pain humans cause one another made sense to him, but she didn't realize how much he envied her ability to make a difference in the world.